Well, I mean, the Companion is a gathering of critical voices, and basically what connects it one chapter to the next is that each of the contributors is an authority in the field of Irish writing. But we have matched different critical voices to different subjects in such a way that, for instance, Terence Brown, one of the world authorities on Yeats, is actually writing about Seamus Heaney. A younger poet scholar, Peter MacDonald, is writing about Paul Muldoon. And we've been able to twin the subject and the writer in such a way that it's going to spark different kinds of critical responses. And that has happened. I mean, one of the things that I'm most excited about as the editor of this companion is to see how people have addressed writers, poets who may not be that well known. For instance, there's the tragic story of Francis Ledwidge, a poet who died in the First World War. Little enough known outside of Ireland in the 21st century. Fran Brereton has written a marvellous essay on him. And Thomas McGreevy, another lesser known figure, very connected to Samuel Beckett, very connected to Joyce and the whole modernist movement in France. Also not that well known outside of Ireland. David Wheatley, a very fine poet, scholar, and critic, has written what I think is a definitive essay on Thomas McGreevy. One of the things that I wanted to make sure we could do with this book, because an opportunity like this doesn't come around all so often, is I also wanted to make sure that we could address the bilingual culture of Ireland, so Irish and English. So you have the two languages which underpin Irish poetic culture. So we've tried to, in a way, refresh the way in which Irish poets have been viewed, and in a way opened up all the windows, let the air in, and say these were the guys and the women and men who wrote poems over the last 400 years. And each to their own time was saying something very different and unique. I suppose one of the expectations of a book like The Companion to Irish Poets is the extent to which Irish poets have actually responded to big historical moments. And we're not just talking about the 20th century, Easter Rising, the War of Independence, the Civil War, going back in time into the 19th century and the Great Famine, go back into the 18th century and the Anglo-Ireland and how it was formed. There's a poet, Egon O'Rahilly, who is at the beginning of the book. Egon's essay explores in great detail, very lucid detail, the way in which an Irish language poet is in a way anticipating historical conflict and breakdown in the generations subsequent. Do you follow me? That the Companion in a way is like a kind of map within which you can see how an Irish language poet in the 18th century is looking at change, historical change, conflict, social turbulence, and how poets coming after him in the 19th century and the 20th century use that in their own work in another language, English. The 60s in Belfast was like the 60s everywhere. There was lots of music around, dancing, very great social life. And alongside that kind of energy and excitement, there was the beginnings of the civil rights movement. And inside the music, the politics, there was also the sense that poetry was a performing art form. And then, as we all know, Northern Ireland, my home, it was engulfed by this political turmoil for a quarter of a century. I had moved, I was living on the west coast of Ireland in a place called Galway, and I started to write and publish poems, and I started to take that a little bit more seriously. But I never felt that I was writing about something. I never felt that I had to write about the conflict, write about the troubles. I did quite a bit of writing about politics and literature, and I think it sensitized me to the kind of the pressures that writers are under when they come from a society in conflict. There was a poet called Pádraic Fake who I knew who was writing these very battered, broken poems out of the conflict of Northern Ireland, the sectarian and violence and so on. But I also was reading writers like Derek Mahon, Michael Longley, Seamus Heaney, senior poets, even back then in the 60s and 70s. And I realized that poetry has to have its own reality, has to have its own structure, its own architecture. And that has to stand separate from the pressures and the intensities, the heat of politics. It can reflect it, it can engage with it, but it has to have its own musculature. For years and years I resisted the notion that I would be sucked into the kind of miasma of the Troubles. But of course you cannot not be. So my first really significant book in my mind was a book that I published in 1985. It was my second book of poems. It was called The Lundy's Letter. And in that book, I tried to actually unpack, to use a word of today, the kind of history that I had come from. Strangely, when I thought I'd moved completely away from all of the damage of politics in the North, all the damage that was done to people, when I started to put this book together for Cambridge, I realized that I'd never actually left it. You actually never do walk away from this stuff. It's there. And one of the things that I've found so rewarding about this and putting this book together is that it sort of it picks up on the historical pressure points in so many different poets' lives and shows that the achievement of their work is how they transcend it, not lose themselves in it. I actually don't know why this is the case, but I can speculate. And I think one of the things that I keep, that seems to me to be one of the main likely reasons, is that Ireland is where it is. It's an island. It is in a way like a conduit through which so many different cultures have moved over many, many, many centuries. Its history is fairly intense and focused. And while there has been great mobility of Irish writers moving out of the country and returning, moving out of the country and returning, there is a sense in which language is Ireland. You look at a writer like Maeve McGuckian. To me, she is the most Joycean of our poets, of contemporary poets. She seems to me to have actually compounded and created a new language in English. Why? How? Well, it must have something to do with the sense in which English and Irish, the language of Gaelic, move in and out of one another in the Ireland of her upbringing and her self-awareness of that from the 50s and 60s. The pressure of history in Ireland has been such that it has made writers, or people who wanted to become poets, more sensitized to how they say what they say. And that's a childhood legacy which has kind of forced them or encouraged them to be more mindful of what language is.